Thank you.
Thanks, John, and welcome all. John didn't mention introducing me. I'm an architect, and so I'm absolved from any kind of technical questions about reefs or anything like that. I'm really here as a warm-up act for Joe. You'll get the substantial stuff from Joe. As a conservation architect, one of my special interests these last few years has been lighthouses, and that's been the cause of visiting the reef more often than I had before. And to get us in the mood, I guess there's a theme running through here about point of view, and I think that James Cook's journal, it's easy to recognise the point of view because it's so different from our own, but also wonderfully documented. So these are pieces of a chart that he drew after his 1770 voyage along the coast. It's oddly oriented. You've got Victoria on the left and New South Wales on the right. The whole chart's been tipped to fit on the page. But you'll notice that the early part of his journey was pretty straightforward navigating. If you know the coast of Victoria and New South Wales, it's generally deep water close up to shore with prominent capes and points sticking out, which is rather easy to navigate, he said dismissingly. Here we get into Queensland a little more, and it gets a bit interesting. Down at the bottom you can see the glass houses, and you can see towards the right lots of islands, so the navigation's getting a bit more complicated. In fact, if you look at it closer, you realise he's missed a few islands and he's just run them together into the mainland. So North Stradbroke and Moreton Island are run together, and Fraser Island is wonderfully attached to the mainland. It gets even more interesting further north. So this bit of the chart starts at Cape Cleveland, near where Townsville is now, and the bit I like is where he's called it the labyrinth. And the reason for that was really about the barrier reef. So from his point of view, he didn't. So here's what you can see from a helicopter. So this is vastly higher up than you get even from the crow's nest on the Endeavour. But that kind of pattern of reefs and shallows and shoals in a sailing ship would have been pretty daunting. So no wonder he called it a labyrinth. And wonderfully, you can read from the names that he gave to places how he was feeling at that moment. So you get names like Cape Tribulation, Weary Bay, Hope Isles, and bottom left, I don't know if you can read it, it says, on this ledge the ship laid 23 hours and received much damage. So you probably remember from school that the Endeavour went onto a reef now called Endeavour Reef and was seriously damaged, and for that 24 hours they were really in a very dire predicament. 2 years out from London, out from England, running low on supplies, pretty worn out. Very, very lucky. So luck and fine seamanship and everyone working together saved the ship, and they got it to the Endeavour River, where it says, Endeavour River, where we repaired the ship. But in fact that was an interesting part of that visit. They actually spent much longer on the land at that spot than anywhere else on the coast. That's where they really had more dealings with Aboriginal people than they had anywhere else. They conversed with them, they traded with them, and they saw their first kangaroo there, and they learned from the local people that it was called a kangaroo. Well, so the log says, and we all know that is what they're called now. So they got off and headed north through this very difficult terrain, lucky to get away through the Torres Strait. This is a map from 1922 and shows what things were like in Queensland around the Barrier Reef before land transport was really sorted out. You see, there wasn't a continuous railway between Brisbane and Cairns at that point. Roads were appalling. So really coastal shipping was the way people got about and goods were moved. And you can see this, this red line here represents the course that ships took. And you see that there's a lot of shipping going up and down the coast, doing that coastal trade, and rather fewer cases where you get channels out through the reef to overseas ports. And that pattern of navigation will be something that Joe will come to later on. Lighthouses. So back here, right down at the south of that map, where we are, yes, there, Lady Elliot Island, which is an island in a surrounding reef, right at the southern end of the Great Barrier Reef. And here was where the first truly local Queensland lighthouse was. Gives my heart, makes me feel good and strong in a Queenslander thinking of this. So this remarkable lighthouse was designed and built in 1873, was first lit. What's remarkable about it is that it's incredibly innovative as a design. It cost a great deal less than the lighthouses that had been built by previous methods. It's got a wooden frame and it's sheeted on the outside with iron plate like a boiler, riveted together and screwed onto the wood. And this was such a success that they built about a dozen of these lighthouses, most of which are still intact, and many of them still functioning as lighthouses, which is how I get to go and see them. Now here's the view. This is probably in the early 1960s, I think, Lady Elliot Island. What we're looking out onto a rather denuded landscape, and it's like that partly because it's been kept clear for visibility of the light. Those are the second generation keepers' houses you see there. But also, back before there was a lighthouse, before the 1870s, this was the site of a guano mine. You might have thought that guano came from Nauru or from South America, but we had our own source of guano, a very important agricultural product in the time before petrochemicals and synthetic fertilisers. So a very valuable commodity, and mining that involves stripping the vegetation completely from the whole of Lady Elliot Island, and it didn't recover for a very long time. In fact, here in this picture, actually 1963 I think is the date of it, you can just see some lines of little plants planted by the light keepers, and there's a note in the visiting engineer's log saying that some of the light keepers have got onto a kind of a tree plant, a beautification binge, I think it said, and planted some trees. Those trees thrived so well, they grew so tall that they obscured the light, and in time a new taller lighthouse had to be built, and that's why this one was abandoned but still looked after. This, of all of those dozen timber and iron lighthouses, this one is my very favourite. This is at a place called North Reef, which is off Gladstone. And what's interesting about it is that it was built in a spot, a little patch of sand in the middle of a fringing reef, where there was nowhere substantial to build houses for keepers to live in. They could only build a lighthouse by building an iron caisson that was dug down into through the sand and sat on the coral base and was filled with concrete. On top of that, they built quite a large lighthouse with this ring of rooms for the keepers to live in. So this was, for most of its life, called a bachelor station. So there's so little room that the keepers couldn't have their families with them. It was normal for keepers to have families. They're more stable and reliable when they've got spouses. But the interesting thing is the patch of sand didn't stay where it was. It's moved. So back here, the lighthouse is built in the middle of the sand. So this is 1878. This is in the 1920s, and by then the sand island had migrated away, and they had to build a kind of walkway to get back and forth to the lighthouse. Interesting that the whole reef system is much more dynamic. It's a little bit like your anecdote about how things change, even though the ranger says that they're just the same as they ever were. By looking at this, you know that's not true. And if you go back now, so this is my photograph from last month, and the island has moved back to pretty much where it was in the 1870s. And that aspect of the reef as a changing, as a dynamic organism, that's my prompt to hand over to Joe.